forget testing.
Hey, man.
Hey.
Yeah, sorry for this so late. I'm really sick right now. I forgot all about it. But I just took 12 seconds to scribble some notes down, and we'll see how it goes.
If only there were some websites out there where you can enter your symptoms and perhaps narrow down your diagnoses and treatments. That would come in a lot of handy right now.
Or you could have free healthcare like we have in Australia and not worry about having to use those oppressive websites.
Well, this is your show, so I'll let you get started there.
Yeah, good. All right, so a couple of things in this, noting that I haven't written much down yet. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is that these websites are often correct, and the reasons that they are often incorrect is for the following. Firstly, you can often get very poor information provided by these things because you're only inputting things like snuffles or like sniffles or like a cough or a sore throat or something, which doesn't really give the website that much information, because often you have to get other things like the tap tests they do on your tests or like the tenderness of your sides and stuff like that. So often the diagnoses are incorrect because of that. Secondly, it's a free thing, and because it is free, it means that there is less information, there's less accountability measures put upon it, because customers who don't pay anything, there's nothing that they can do in response if they get a bad diagnosis. Thirdly, they're often biased in the sense that they are funded by pharmaceutical companies. So if you look on websites like WebMD, they're just flooded with advertisements for specific medications, which means that they have an incentive to not only misdiagnose you incorrectly, but push your diagnosis to the set of like diseases that would make you go and buy that pharmaceutical product. Which means that not only are they lying to you, they're also giving you the things that are not needed for your body, which can sometimes have negative consequences. What are the reasons why people try and use WebMD and stuff like that? One of two reasons. One, they're too lazy or scared to go to the doctor, or two, they can't afford to go to the doctor. Now, in countries like Australia, which have national healthcare systems, that is not a problem. That's also the thing that I would propose on Pro. That is to say that the government should ban these self-diagnoses websites and fill the void with a healthcare system that does not require those things to occur. Secondly, for people who are scared to go to these healthcare institutions, that's only a problem when either they have no insurance behind them, which is also something that gets nationalized away, or secondly, they just don't like going to the doctor. At which point, I would kind of say tough. You know, it's part of being an adult in society is taking responsibility for your body and making sure that you're going to the doctor when you're feeling sick. So, and obviously, there's a responsibility inbuilt on to do that, because if you're sick, you can make other people sick, which spreads the disease around, which is unfair on other people who didn't consent to that. So, those are the reasons why they're often incorrect. They're biased in the application, and the state has an obligation to fill the void there. What are the problems with the system that occurs right now? One, in the circumstance in which they misdiagnose you, you're often going to act on bad information, which means you're going to stay sick, or you're going to make yourself sicker. Secondly, they have a tendency to hyperbolize the things that you get. So I don't know if you know like the meme, but like if you go on WebMD, it's very likely to say you have cancer, or you have you've got like thrombosis or something really awful. Now, what that means is not only does that make people unhappy, but it pushes people in the direction of buying specific pharmaceutical products, which are not healthy for them, are often exceptionally expensive and drive them bankrupt, and don't even fix the problem, because it's not the thing with which they actually had in the first place. This has a devastating impact on both their self-esteem and their personal economic position, which I think is a pretty bad thing. So those are the generic reasons why I think the government should ban self-diagnosis websites, but I'll pass over to you.
Well, let's first address your argument that has to do with government filling the void. You say that governments should take responsibility for their citizens' health by providing means through which they can achieve medical care. As I have just pointed out in the links, your government is in fact one that has done this by providing its own symptom checker. So is the United Kingdom's National Health Service. In fact, even government-run health systems are finding that by promoting online tools to allow people to self-triage, to treat minor ailments themselves, or to determine on the front end whether they need to see a doctor or what kind of doctor they need to see, that this is a benefit to the consumer or to the citizen, even in a public health system. So Australia has healthdirect.gov.au/symptom checker. NHS has its own symptom checker. Generally speaking, though, that feeds into a response to your criticism, alleging that these websites are driven by profit motive and specifically pharmaceutical motive. First, when we actually look at who is publishing these symptom checkers, you've singled out WebMD, but some of the other symptom checkers that are out there are run by Harvard Medical School through their Family Medical Guide, the Mayo Clinic, and iTriage. All of these are run by nonprofit organizations, whether it's the Mayo Clinic itself, which even though the doctors there obviously make a boatload of money, the Mayo Clinic itself is a nonprofit facility. NHS, we've already talked about. Australia's national health system, we've talked about. Harvard Medical School is technically a not-for-profit. We can leave for another day how exactly it is that something with that big of an endowment is considered a not-for-profit in the U.S., but that's how we roll over here. So what we're seeing is that public service organizations like you're talking about are in fact finding these symptom checkers as an effective way to deliver medical information to people. Now, as for whether they are run by pharmaceutical companies, obviously there's pharmaceutical advertisements on these websites, but WebMD in particular that you singled out is in fact run by doctors. The 4 senior members of their editorial board are doctors. So when you criticize the type of information that are on there, the misdiagnoses, the limited information, my response is that the controls on those already exist because doctors are the ones who are responsible for the symptom checkers who are on the editorial boards of these websites. Government already imposes controls over the types of communications that doctors can put out there. They are controlled by medical ethics, and unless they have lengthy disclaimers, they could be under the control of malpractice laws. However, these websites do usually contain those sorts of lengthy disclaimers that tell people the limited extent to which you're actually supposed to rely on these. Now, going back to the advertisement angle, though, these often, and especially in the case of WebMD, they're tools that drive traffic to these websites where people are directed towards other information. So you've got a secondary purpose out there of outside the symptom checker. WebMD has a wealth of articles on general lifestyle information, more general health information, and that independently justifies allowing them to have the symptom checker because it is a way to get people to this information by drawing them in with one thing and then providing them access to other resources. Now, you've pointed out it is a valid criticism that these websites are often giving limited information. I would say that is intentional. When you go to WebMD and you put in symptoms, even if you give more, you can only get out what you put in. When you say if you're only putting in sniffles, you're going to get a whole lot of different diseases that might not give you any meaningful narrowing down. You're right. However, even in the instance that you're putting in several symptoms and getting a range of potential illnesses, that's intentional so that people aren't relying too much on a specific diagnosis. You wouldn't, in fact, want a symptom checker that if you put in 5 symptoms, it would automatically give you cancer because you don't want people thinking they have cancer when they don't. However, even the people who have criticized these symptom checkers have pointed out that often it's that top level, that base information that you really want people to have. Dr. Ativ Mehrotra of the BMJ, Bureau of Medical. BMJ is a major medical publication in the U.S., and I'm blanking on the acronym, but they did a study criticizing symptom checkers, basically. I'll post a link in the comments. But one of the things that one of the researchers said was that even though they found the symptom checkers would give people the correct diagnosis in the top 3 results about 50% of the time. She said, quote, "It's not nearly as important for a patient with a fever, headache, stiff neck, and confusion to know whether they have meningitis or encephalitis as it is for them to know that they should get to an ER quickly." So you're correct when you say that people need to take responsibility for their bodies, but these symptom checkers are in fact a way for them to do that, to determine how quickly they need to go to a doctor, whether they need to use emergency services or whether they need to wait to see their general practitioner. And that leads into my final point. These symptom checkers are a form of self-triage. In pretty much every health system around the world, public and private, we have a problem with people using emergency services for non-emergency situations. We have a problem of people of wait list times to see even general practitioners. These sorts of tools can help people determine whether they need to be using those emergency services, whether it's worth the tax on the system to go to the ER, or whether their symptoms only merit waiting to see a general practitioner. It may also help them determine when they see their general practitioner if there's a particular specialist to whom they should be seeking a referral, as opposed to making the physician do all of the work to try to narrow it down for them. So, in fact, these symptom checkers are a way for adults to take responsibility for their bodies. That was a little bit disorganized. I hope I haven't overloaded the system here, but I'll go ahead and throw it back to you for my responses to your opening salvo.
Yeah, no problem. Don't worry about disorganization. Actually, I've gotten a lot of. Oh no, it's gone now. I was gonna say, yeah, don't worry about being disorganized. I'm not super organized at the moment. So I'll respond to everything you've said. They're a little bit out of order. I'm firstly going to start with your claim that the existence of lifestyle websites justifies the existence of symptom checkers. I'm not opposed to lifestyle websites that provide information about you. I'm opposed to websites that ask for symptoms and then tell you what you should do as a response to that. Those are the things I'm opposed to. The next thing you tell me is that WebMD and other websites are run by doctors, and there are restrictions on the way in which doctors act right now. I mean, there are restrictions on the way in doctors act, but like, you can't tell me in all of your time as a lawyer you've never met a bad lawyer. Like, there are obviously financial incentives on WebMD, as they themselves are funded by pharmaceutical companies to push you in specific directions. Like, even if you just open up the website of WebMD, like, the very first thing at the top at the moment is turmeric, a healthy remedy, or your spice rack. And if you click on that, there's just a bunch of links to a bunch of different like advertisements that sell things like that. So I think it's disingenuous to say that they're purely good in that thing. Now, your response to that is then to say, well, there are lengthy disclaimers. And this is the third thing I'm going to say in this bit, is that yes, there are lengthy disclaimers, and that legally absolves them of any responsibility of the information that they're giving to the person who is sick. But the problem is that no one reads those lengthy disclaimers. They read it, and then they just think that that's enough. There's a cognitive bias called invincibility bias, which is just basically you always downplay the effects that your body is having upon you. And what this just means is that when you get a list of things, so you're saying that they should self-triage, when you get a list of things of that they should go to the doctor and they should not, they're more than likely going to pick the one that says don't go to the doctor, and or like the illness that implies that they should not go to the doctor. And the reason for that is not just the incivility bias, like there's the inconvenience of going to the doctor, the cost of going to the doctor, the fear of going to the doctor. And all of those things mean that they go into this website and then they get into a self-confirmation bias cycle of not going to the doctor over and over and over. That makes them sicker, or they're going to have to buy the drugs that they are pushed into doing so, which also makes them sicker. The next thing so to clear up, then you identified that there are government websites that do the same thing. I would point out two things. One, if you look at the government website versus WebMD, one of the top things on the government website is just like, if you're feeling sick, go to the doctor, whereas the WebMD one is asking you to buy all these different things. So there is a difference in intent there. I'm much more against the WebMD variant than I am against the government variant, but in the interest of the debate, I will also defend the government not having these websites as well. So that is to say, none of these websites, if you're sick, you should go to the doctor. The next thing you say is a quote from the BMJ, and the intent of which is that these websites act as a blunt force instrument, such that they can triage whether or not they should go to the doctor or whether or not they should not. I've already responded to this in part by saying there's an incentive for individuals not to go to the doctor at all. There's also an incentive on the corporatized versions of these websites to stay away from the doctor and get away from a third-party advice on your medical treatment, as opposed to just diagnosing yourself and then buying the things there. So that means that there's a lot of incentives to not do that. The next thing you say is, well, we should self-triage because there's already a long wait list for like the GPs and people don't like going for the GPs and stuff like that. I think the thing I would point out here is that in the circumstance in which whether they're going to the ER or they're not going to the ER, if you're sick enough to go to the ER and you're not realizing it, I think you are the absolute minority of people. I think people who are exceptionally ill and who are in need of treatment in the ER are not going to need this symptom diagnosis website to do it. So I don't really think they're a performative function in this debate. The next thing you say is, well, there's people going to the GP and we should, limit the wait times there. I want to analyze the difference here between the impact of a false positive and the impact of a false negative. The impact of a false positive is going to the doctor when you actually don't need to. That is to say, you clog up some wait times, you lose $30 in the Australian healthcare system. I don't know how, I imagine it's a lot more in America, you rustle everyone's jimmies who you've made the line a little bit longer for. Compare that to the impact of a false negative, which is not going to the doctor even though you needed to go to the doctor, which means you continue to get sick. It can likely, for example, things like appendicitis, which cirrhose the appendix and can sometimes burst and sometimes be lethal. The impact of those things is wildly disparate. And what I would say there is, it's better that the government promote a system where everyone goes to the doctor if they're ill or they're feeling ill. Yes, that may increase wait times. It also decreases the enormous impact that a false negative can have on people's lives. Now, WebMD and other self-diagnosis websites, including the government's role in this, is such that it increases the prevalence of false negatives because people, as I said before, have that invincibility bias. And also, if it does make wait times longer, that just puts more pressure on the government to improve the healthcare system, or more pressure on private organizations to streamline their system there. So even though it does make the problem worse, there's a self-correcting mechanism which makes the problem less bad. The final thing I want to say in this is just an extra argument I thought up while you were speaking, is that I think these websites make people trust physicians less. And what I mean by that is that it makes information, I don't know if you've probably experienced this too as a lawyer. They say, what do I need a lawyer for? I can Google everything that they learned at law school. What do I need a doctor for? I can go, just look up everything they learned in med school, which means that these self-diagnosis websites not only mean that people go to the doctor less, but means when they do go to the doctor, they trust it less. If the doctor says something that they disagree with or they don't want to hear, for example, a more expensive treatment or an experimental treatment that they want to try, and the doctor says, no, that's you're not an appropriate candidate for that, or if you do it's likely to make you more sick, or it's likely to make you expensive. But they've got the idea in their head that they want that treatment or they want that experimental exposure to the medicine. And what that means is that they're more likely to opt into medicines that are less bad for them rather than what the physician is explicitly telling them to do. And I think that makes their lives worse as well. I'll pass over.
Well, on the subject of lawyers and legal things, in your opening salvo, you said you talked about people taking responsibility for themselves. When I pointed out that these websites have extensive disclaimers that tell you what you should and shouldn't use the information for, your response was, well, no one reads those disclaimers. So my question to you is, what happened to people taking responsibility for themselves? Your complaint about these websites is inadequacy of information, but when I point out a place where they give extensive information on exactly what you should use the symptom checkers for, what they're good for, what they're not good for, your response is, well, people just don't read those. So you've got a contradictory argument here. Is the problem that people take in too much information from these websites and don't know what to do with it? Or is it that they don't take in enough information? Is it that they read too much or that they read too little? But another one of your lawyer analogies was pretty helpful to my understanding your perspective on the issue. When you said, what about people who will say, well, I can, what do I need a lawyer for? I can Google whatever. Of course, we run into this as lawyers. In fact, we make an awful lot of money off of those people because they usually sue royally. Not something you see nearly as much in medicine because people are a lot more likely to gamble with a contract than they are to gamble with their health. That is, until the contract goes sour or you're in a will contest. However, there is a much more positive side to this. In law, we have found that when people have access to general information, that they are able to narrow down exactly what it is they need from a lawyer, so that 30-minute consultation becomes a 10-minute conversation and the lawyer can get to work more quickly. This is why those of us in the legal profession have put a lot more time and resources into websites like the ABA has an Ask a Lawyer service. My own state, Tennessee, has one. I believe Virginia, the other state that I'm licensed in, has one as well. We have lawyer referral services where people basically say, I think I need this, and you send them to a lawyer that does that specific specialty. Well, specialty is a loaded word in law. That's a topic for another time. But a lawyer who does that specific type of law. Or when they finally, or when they get a consultation with a lawyer, they walk in and they say, I think I need X. And it's a much straighter line than listening to them ramble for an hour about their situation and trying to figure out the facts. They've narrowed down a few things that they might need. This is very similar to an effective use of a symptom checker. Your concern seems to be that people are going to put their symptoms into a symptom checker, that they're going to get a single diagnosis, and that they're going to ride that basically till all the way through the process. The reality of these symptom checkers, again, the Harvard study that I mentioned, and when I get a moment, we'll post that in the links, did find that in 50% of the cases, these symptom checkers deliver the correct diagnosis within the top 3 results. And that's over a broad a study of a broad range of actual diagnoses. So you had a range of people who might have been putting in just 2 or 3 symptoms like you talked about earlier versus people who might have been putting in a lot of other symptoms. Across the board, it was about 50% of the time they got the right diagnosis in the top 3, but it was still just giving them the top 3. They still had to go to a physician at some point if the correct diagnosis required treatment. So even if they wanted those pharmaceuticals, for instance, you keep talking about the danger of people just going and seeking the pharmaceuticals. They still have to go to a doctor to get the pharmaceuticals. And the doctor still has to agree that this is the right pharmaceutical. So you still have that independent check outside of the broad hammer of the government that keeps these websites from being used in the ways that you're concerned about. Which leads me back to the central problem with the resolution. We've seen that doctors believe these symptom checkers have utility. The people who run public health systems believe these symptom checkers have utility. The people who run medical schools, in particular Harvard, believe these symptom checkers have utility. The people who run the Mayo Clinic believe that these symptom checkers have utility. It's backwards then to say the government should ban self-diagnosis websites when we're talking about the government, we're specifically talking about the arms of the government that do not have this same medical expertise. What you're effectively saying is that the government, the political parts of the government, should be able to override the judgment of the medical parts of the government, the medical parts of the private sector, the medical parts of the education sector, in banning these websites altogether. And that ultimately is where I believe the resolution fails, is that for all the criticisms that you've thrown out, and I think I've addressed most of those criticisms, the bludgeon that is recommended by the resolution itself, that the government should ban self-diagnosis websites, is clearly an overbroad measure to address even the legitimate criticisms that you brought up. Back to you.
Cool. Do you drive?
Yes.
If you took your car to the mechanic and you asked him what the problem was, and he got it right 50% of the time, but the other half of the time he got it wrong, would you go back to that mechanic?
Yeah, because that's actually a pretty good percentage for mechanics,
I mean, I don't
especially
know what
on the.
mechanics are like in America, but that's not like what it is in Australia. What your case is saying by quoting the Harvard study is that a system that is dealing with people's lives, whether or not they will continue to live or continue to live with or without pain, is acceptable for it to be right 50% of the time. That is a coin flip that I think is unacceptable and is not a problem that occurs in doctors right now. Yes, they sometimes get it wrong, but they also refer you and you can always come back to them. That doesn't exist for a website. So I think it's absolutely ludicrous to claim that just because they got it 50% right in the top 3 responses of the time and then make sure that people choose which response to make is pretty silly. If it is the case that the top 3 responses need treatment and then they go to the doctor, then they're going to the doctor anyway, and it doesn't seem any different from my side of the house, except your side has the problem of false negatives of the top 3 of that 50% of the time it's wrong. You needed to go to the doctor, but you didn't, and then you were a false negative problem, which meant that you didn't go to the doctor, and then you suffered. That seems utterly ludicrous to me. It means that people are going to suffer under your side of the house. The next thing you tell me is that there is an additional layer of check. That's to say, if you need to get those pharmaceutical medicines, then the doctor would have to sign off on it. That's not true. All of the things that are promoted on WebMD and stuff like that are over-the-counter medicines, which means you don't need to go to the doctor for it. You can just go to the pharmacy and get it with cash, which means that's actually not a check there, which means people still do suffer under my side of the house because there is no other accountability mechanism. The next thing you tell me is that, well, lots of different bodies like Harvard Medicine and the healthcare system and governments all use these websites, and thus we should you negate the resolution. One, that's just an appeal to authority. It's not an argument. Secondly, I would like to look at the incentives, which mean those governments do use those websites. So, for example, the government is lobbied by those pharmaceutical bodies to make sure those websites exist because it's in their strict best interest for people to go over the counter rather than going around them to the doctor. Secondly, corporate websites like WebMD have an incentive by the pharmaceutical industry to lie about the things that people need such that they go over the counter. Thirdly, government and independent organizations have an incentive for these websites to work because it means that it lowers the stress and protests and lobbying around them to improve the healthcare system of that country. That is to say, if people are being diverted to these Diagnose Me websites, they're not going to doctors, which means that there's less strain on the system and thus less impact on them to try and improve the system. It's a band-aid solution that fucks over people and means that people are going to suffer unnecessarily, which means that you can't trust on face value what these things are saying. The purpose of the debate is to argue about the reasons behind these actions, not necessarily just like what has been said previously. The next thing you tell me is to say there's a contradiction in my case, which is to say that people should take responsibility, but I say that they shouldn't be or that they can't take responsibility. It's not a contradiction about how much information they have or how little information they have, but the way that they interpret that information, which is to say the invincibility bias, which is to say that it's your body, mind over matter, I can control what I'm doing, I'm strong enough, means that people are going to interpret this information poorly unless it's coming from an authority figure like a doctor. This is different for lawyers because like when you're engaging in a legal system, that's external to you. You know, like it's the contract, it's the will and stuff that you have very little knowledge about. Whereas people have a bias towards their body because they've been in it since they were born. It's the thing that they always have with them and is the thing that they think that they control more than anything, which means that they are likely to interpret that information differently. The next thing you tell me is to say, well, lawyers have Diagnose Me websites, and those things are better. The first response is the thing I just said, which is say that people interpret that information differently, which is not an argument in favor of Diagnose Me websites. But secondly, look at the harm of the false negative. In a in a lawyer system, yes, the false negative can be pretty bad. Like, you haven't paid your taxes in 7 years, and the IRS or the ATO is going to come rip you a new one. That's a big harm. It's a significantly smaller harm than people dying, or people living in suffering, or people, ruining their organs and thus having to go on an organ wait list. So what I'm saying here is that health is the most important thing that people have, because it not only dictates how long you can live, but the quality of life that you have throughout that duration, which means that the government and all interested parties should prefer a world in which people go to the doctor rather than to the self-diagnose me websites, which means that they get the accurate information the fastest, and that puts pressure on the government to solve the problems of long wait lists. I'll pass over.
I'm going to challenge you pretty strongly on the idea that going to a doctor is the fastest solution. In fact, what I've read to you earlier from the experts is that these symptom checkers are seen as a triage tool, so that people have something to rely on before they go to the doctor. You ask, what's the difference if you go to the symptom checker versus if you go to the doctor? The answer is what you do in the meantime. What doctor do you call, first of all, and what do you do before you get to the doctor? Now, you've raised this specter of pharmaceuticals, and when you first started, I thought you were talking about big pharma, but then you switched and said, no, all these pharmaceuticals, this is what you said, all the pharmaceuticals advertising on these websites are over the counter. Well, first of all, if they're over the counter, then you're hardly talking about the big pharma problem, because that's not even where big pharma makes its money. It's not on Tylenol, it's on the cancer drugs. Second, over the counter medications, by their very nature, don't do much except alleviate symptoms. Now, which leads me back to what happens in the meantime. All right, let's say the symptom checker gives you a top 3, and one of them is you've got a cold, and the other one is you've got cancer. What it does in the meantime is tell you that you can safely take pain medicine X, Y, or Z, and it alleviates this suffering. So, in fact, all of this human suffering that you're pointed to can be alleviated by the symptom checker if it points you to an over-the-counter drug that you can take that's not going to make you worse, that's not going to make you sicker, and that's going to make you feel better in the short term. And then when you go back to what the symptom checker tells you to do next, it still says, go to a doctor, call a doctor. Now, that leads me to your odd claims about these government-run symptom checkers in particular. First of all, I would have to see some evidence that NHS or the Australian health system has been lobbied by these pharmaceutical companies to put out these symptom checkers. My understanding is that those socialized health systems help remove the profit motive that is supposedly behind big pharma here in the U.S. in the first place. So that would be a rather odd use of lobbying dollars for the pharmaceutical company, rather than to say, hey, NHS, you need to buy more of our big money drugs, to say, hey, NHS, we're going to lobby your MPs because we want to make sure you've got a symptom checker out there so we can sell more Tylenol. That's a claim that absolutely needs some hard evidence as to what exactly is the goal in these specifically countries that have government-run symptom checkers. The other claim you made about government-run symptom checkers was that it created less incentive to improve the system. I'm honestly having trouble following that claim, because these symptom checkers don't do anything when it comes to, they might reduce wait times for general practitioners by telling people you can stay home and take some Tylenol, but it's certainly not going to reduce wait times when a doctor has already said you need surgery. It's not going to reduce the wait times for elective or mandatory surgery, which are already, I believe a study I saw earlier today said that for Category 3 surgeries, the average wait time in Australia is 40 days right now. In the UK, it's as much as 9 months, is my understanding. Symptom checker is not going to fix that, because the doctor's already involved at that point when the surgery wait time is already problematic. And those are the more pressing issues when it comes to improving the system versus this front-end triage. Now, speaking of the triage issue, you talk a lot about the. I'm having a little trouble following false positives versus false negatives, but I think what you are saying you're concerned about is the person who gets told by the symptom checker that they're fine and they're not. Well, in the United States in particular, the opposite situation is a much bigger strain, in particular on our emergency system, because we have a law called EMTALA that says if you go to the ER, basically they have to triage and treat you somehow. And people who don't have health coverage, or who do have health coverage and are just too impatient to wait the couple of days to go to the doctor, use the ER as a primary care mechanism. What I'm saying is if they went to these symptom checkers first and found out they don't even need to go to a GP with any urgency, that alleviates the burden on the emergency system, which is going to alleviate the pain and suffering of the people who are waiting to get limbs reattached, or who are in active high-risk labor in the ER, or other people who are in severe distress that are having to wait to be triaged in the emergency situation because someone who could have used a symptom checker to find out all they needed was Tylenol, insert registered trademark symbol here, could have stayed at home and waited to go to their GP. So when you talk about people dying, people living in suffering, we're concerned about the same problem. And so are the medical practitioners who support these symptom checkers. Dr. Hannah Simmergan of HMS was a research assistant who helped with that BMJ study I mentioned earlier. And what she said was, with symptom trackers, we're looking at the first generation of new technology. It's important to track their performance to see if they can reach their full potential in helping patients get the right care. So that leads me back to the central problem with the resolution, that government should ban self-diagnosis websites. Clearly, the medical community itself sees these tools as having potential utility in alleviating the very human suffering that you're talking about. They see the utility in these government-run systems of using them to improve patient outcomes, to reduce front-end strain on the system, especially when it comes to seeing general practitioners. If these medical professionals see the potential benefit and want to continue with the experiment and continue to improve the way symptom checkers work, improve their implementations, and improve their outcomes, then I'll simply put it to you for your last salvo. Why is it that you think the political government, the same one, by the way, that you were concerned about using these symptom checkers to get itself off the hook for improving medical care in general, why should the political arms of the government, the non-medical arms of the government, ban these websites when these medical professionals say that they have utility even if they are flawed?
When debates say that the government should... Sorry, you're just doing feedback. Yeah. When debates say that the government should, it's not saying like any specific branch of the government should. It's just saying, in general, this thing should be banned. So I don't think that's a reasonable attack. I'll take 3 minutes, and you can have the remaining 350 or whatever it is. Although I do have like a cross-X thing. The thing I want to ask is, if the benefit of these websites, or one of the benefits of these websites, is triage, what's the disease that you have that you go on the website and it says you need to go to the ER or you need to go to the doctor that you would not have known to do anyway?
Well, I would point to the example I read earlier. And again, it can be about the symptom and not necessarily the diagnosis. A patient that has fever, headache, stiff neck, and confusion as a combination of symptoms might not know that those four things in combination mean you need to go directly to the ER. So that's just one example. Another example is the stroke symptoms, FAST. If you don't already know that acronym and you think you might just be having a minor headache, then a symptom checker might tell you, no, this combination of symptoms should send you to the ER. On the converse side, um, I'll go a little bit anecdotal on you. The reason that I wear this head covering when I do these debates is that I've got scars from shingles that I had last year. When those spots first appeared on my head, the first thing that my wife and I both thought was skin cancer. And I was prepared the next day to make a call to my skin specialist because I already had one, because I thought I might have melanoma. It was, in fact, a symptom checker website that led me to instead call my GP because my symptoms also matched shingles. So that's an example of self-triage. You talk about the invincibility syndrome, but there's also Munchausen's or lighter versions of Munchausen's. And I was raised in a Munchausen's household.
Yeah.
So that's the flip side of it.
Yeah. People with Munchausen's are a minority of people within society. Everyone has the invincibility complex, which is why we think we can do things that we can't. Look, what I've got from that is that sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. I think you're avoiding the two big harms. The first is, by your analysis, 50% of the time it is wrong, which means 50% of the time there's a very high likelihood of a false negative, which means you don't go to the doctor even though you should have. Like the fact that you knew the symptoms of a stroke, right? Apply that knowledge to the shingles, right? Say you knew what the symptoms for Say you knew what the symptoms for shingles were, and you saw those spots on your head, and you were like, I've got shingles, time to just go to the pharmacy. And that turned out to be cancer, you know? Like, because the symptoms are very the same. The thing I'm pointing out here is what you just said was a favorable knowledge that you happen to have that benefited you, whereas a lot of people won't have that knowledge. What I'm suggesting is that you remove that problem entirely, have everyone go to the doctor when they need to. Now, your claim there was that you didn't understand how the mechanism for improving the government would be. If there's long wait times right now, and these symptoms alleviate wait time, these websites alleviate wait times, that means the government has no incentive to hire more doctors, to improve the number of nurses, to increase the size and efficiency of hospitals. These things make it such that it's harder to fix the problem. My suggestion puts pressure on the government to fix that problem. The final thing I'll say is that you say it's about what they do in the meantime, where you go to the pharmacy and alleviate symptoms. You could do that anyway. The problem is if they're wrong and you go into the pharmacy to get the generic drug to alleviate your symptoms, you still have the disease that is undiagnosed by the Diagnose Me website, which means that you're likely going to suffer in the future if that thing develops. 50% is simply unacceptable for this, and that's why I would propose a motion. And thanks for debating me. I'll pass back over.
I think that sums up your position pretty well. The problem is if they are wrong. What you seem to be missing is the long parade of things that can happen post-symptom checker if the symptom checker is wrong. First of all, just because the symptom checker is wrong does not mean people aren't going to go to the doctor anyway, or that they're not going to go to the doctor if they develop additional symptoms. If you've got cancer, then a month difference between you going to the doctor and not going to the doctor, it may be life or death, but it may actually not make any difference because it would have taken you a month to see a specialist anyway. And the 50% figure, 50% on a symptom checker that you're just filling out yourself of the top 3 diseases that you get being correct is actually a pretty good clip when you look at it. The other part of that study was that if you limited it to the top 20 results, it was right almost 2/3 of the time. But all that top 3 gives you is a range. You are still responsible for what you do with the information. If we trust people to be responsible with the information, which we should, if we trust doctors to be responsible with the administration of the symptom checkers, which we should, if we trust the medical community's analysis that these symptom checkers have utility both now and in the future, which we should, then the resolution saying that we should ban self-diagnosis websites, however you interpret government, is at best grossly premature, and at worst has the potential to stifle the development of these symptom checkers into tools that lack some of the problems that we're talking about here, and can in fact be important tools in both triage and diagnosis and patient communication between doctors and patients on the front end, on the back end, and in improving health outcomes in general. Thanks for your time, Liam. Have a good day.
Thanks.